Secretary Mayorkas, yesterday your impeachment trial ensued in the Senate. I don't see this as a happy day or a day that I take relish or pleasure in, but it's a sad day in the sense that it's come to this. This isn't a debate over policy. This was a debate over malfeasance, a debate over whether you've been telling the truth and whether you've been enforcing the law. We have a disaster at our southern border, a disaster that becomes very personal to people. Lake and Riley's family, this disaster cost them the loss of a loved one. We have a disaster where people show up at the border every day and they just simply say, hey, I'm Joe Smith from Venezuela, and then they waltz on in. There's supposed to be rules. There are rules about paroling people. Under the Trump administration, a very small number of people were paroled. Under this administration, it's become a blanket parole. There's been the question, and you've been asked repeatedly, you testified to Senator Graham last year that parole is individualized. But then the administration has admitted that it's a public benefit to have migrants come in as migrants as opposed to illegal aliens, as if it's a difference. You know, 1 million people come by and we don't see them at all, and 1 million people come by and they stop and we give them migrant status, and somehow that's better, and there's a public benefit to that. But that's not individualized. That's judging people as a group. But I can't help but be sad for Lake and Riley and her family who didn't have to have this. And he wasn't paroled for any of those reasons. And we're going to get into that in the question and answer. You've either said you don't have the knowledge, you've been asked about this multiple times, but we're going to ask again, how did the murder of Lake and Riley get into this country? And what is the statute that allowed you to do it? How could you? And how could you sleep at night, you know, having done that? You know, there are laws. I mean, and that's what this is about. It isn't about whether or not the Biden administration believes in an open border policy. It's about whether we have laws and you're going to enforce them at all. The last administration was enforcing the law, and you just haven't been enforcing the law. And millions of people are coming across, and they've committed heinous crimes and murder. And Lake and Riley's family will never get her back. And yet that man came in and apparently was let go because they said it was full. There's no statute saying that when the camps are full, you just let people in. We have a system where we're just saying, hey, what's your name? And then we fingerprint you and then off you go. I mean, we had over 300 people on the terrorist watch list come in and then are found at a later date to be on the watch list. We have people coming to New York. We fly them to New York. We give them money. We put them up in a hotel. They assault a police officer, and then as they come out past the cameras, they're flipping the bird to everybody in America. That's a sad day for America, and you presided over this. You presided over just a disastrous border. And it isn't a matter of policy. It isn't a matter of you like open borders and we like, a more secure border. There's a law. We have a law, and you're supposed to enforce that law. And yesterday was a sad day because the majority went ahead and set the precedent that having lied to Congress, there wasn't going to be an examination of whether you lied to Congress. They were just going to simply say lying to Congress didn't rise high enough to be high crimes and misdemeanors. Chairman says, oh, we're just throwing rocks is why we didn't fix the border policy. It's just not true at all. The fix that was advanced legislatively was a fix that would have allowed 5,000 people a day before we would have taken extraordinary measures to try to slow the influx of migrants. But even after 5,000 a day, it was going to let migrants of no limit still come through the ports of entry. So it really wasn't a reform. It was a whitewash. All of the laws that existed under the Trump administration still exist under the Biden administration. You have all the powers that you need. The laws on accepting migrants to this country says the executive may admit migrants. Doesn't say the executive branch shall admit migrants. You could simply say we're full up and we've got too many criminals and we've got the horrendous thing that happened to Lake and Riley and to others. And we're just full, and we're going to stop taking migrants for a while until we can sort out the mess we have at the border. You have every power to do that now. You just don't utilize those powers. But it isn't about really being good at utilizing the power. We just think you're not obeying the law. And I think it is a sad day. Yesterday was a sad day that we had to impeach a member of the cabinet. But today is a sad day that the majority chose not to even hear the arguments, not to see the proof one way or the other and have a real trial. So I look forward to trying to get some of the answers today, and I hope you will tell the truth. I hope you will not just simply say, I don't know. You've been asked many times about Laken Riley's family. You should know everything about the alleged murderer, and I hope you'll explain to us how he got into this country and why that happened.
You're welcome, Mr. Cuellar. We are now recognize Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I want to go back to a statement that you made in response to the chairman's question about how many people we have deported. You said 630,000 have been returned. That is not accurate. The actual ICE deportations is 142,580. All those other people that you're talking about were rejected at the border. These are not ICE deportations, and you conflate those two numbers, and it's aggravating to me that you do that. Now, and here we are. We've got the same problem that we had a year ago when you were here. In fact, since you last testified before us, 2.4 million people have crossed our southern border. That's more than 4 years of President Trump's presidency combined. Your immigration policy is in chaos. You don't need Congress to do anything. The president's got the ability to do it. You just need to talk to him to get it done. Now, in fiscal year 23, there were 294 illegal aliens on the terrorist watch list that were arrested between ports of entry. And those are just the ones we caught. How many more are there in the 1.7 million gotaways that we've had over the last 3 years? Last year, as I mentioned earlier, we deported 142,580 people. But more than that have crossed the border every month for the last 36 months. We have 6.1 million. Listen to this number, people. 6.1 million people in the interior of this country on the non-detained docket. Almost double what it was in 2020. Of those, roughly 13%, 1.2 million of them have orders for removal, Mr. Secretary. Why haven't you removed those 1.2 million? You said you deported 630,000. No, you didn't. They've exhausted their due process. They've been told they have to get out. They've got orders to leave this country, and you let them stay. Migrants in cities across America are waiting to get an appointment in an ICE office. These are the ones that are on the non-detained list. They're waiting years. And despite all the evidence of this crisis, at every single turn, this administration has undermined our safety and our security. You halted the wall construction. You ended migration protection protocols. You've created this mass parole program, and you're making inadequate requests for detention space. This administration's failure is making our communities less safe. We have people crossing the border without identification. We don't know who they are. I've talked to you about this before, about the improper vetting that is going on. And your default policy seems to be to just let them in. We can't figure out who they are. We don't know who they are for sure because they're not in any database. Come on in. Just a couple years ago in my hometown in Jacksonville, we had a 28-year-old illegal immigrant he was 23, murder one of my constituents. CBP encountered him and couldn't confirm who he was or how old he was because he had no identification. But he said he was a juvenile, used a fake name. So under your catch and release policy that you reinstituted after President Trump had ended that, handed him off to HHS, and then it wasn't until after he killed Mr. Cuellar, not this Mr. Cuellar, but Cuellar in Jacksonville, that we find out who he is. It's Mr. Yoha, and he's now serving 60 years in Florida State Prison. Just last month, we saw another one. Horrible murder because we failed to properly vet an individual, and Laken Riley was murdered by him. Look, I want states to work with, I want state and local law enforcement to work with ICE. We did in my jurisdiction when I was sheriff in Jacksonville. We had a great 287G program, and that's a fantastic program. And in fact, I'm not the only one that thinks that. Last year, acting director of ICE, Ty Johnson, told this committee that the 287G program, and I'll quote, is the best thing since sliced bread because it acts as a force multiplier. So my question for you very quickly is, Do you agree with the director's assessment of the 287G program? And if so, what are you doing to expand it?
Congressman, the public safety and security of this country is our highest priority. I
Doesn't
believe,
appear so.
Congressman, if you'll allow me, I believe that when an individual poses a threat to public safety or national security, a local or state jurisdiction should cooperate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for the swift detention and removal of that individual.
So you didn't answer my question. Do you think 287G program is a good program, and will you work with us to expand it?
Congressman, I continue to believe that 287G, when executed properly, is a force multiplier for our enforcement efforts.
Is that a yes?
As I said, when it is executed properly, it is a force multiplier for our enforcement efforts.
You can't get a straight answer out of this guy. Look, I see my time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Are you familiar with an Israeli study that had 2.5 million patients and found that the vaccinated group was actually 7 times more likely to get infected with COVID than the people who had gotten COVID naturally?
Senator, I'd have to get back to you on that one. I'm not familiar with that study.
Well, you think you might want to be if you're going to travel the country insulting the millions of Americans, including NBA star Jonathan Isaac, who have had COVID, recovered, look at a study with 2.5 million people and say, well, you know what? It looks like my immunity is as good as a vaccine or not. And in a free country, maybe I ought to be able to make that decision. Instead, you've chosen to travel the country calling people like Jonathan Isaac and others, myself included, flat earthers. We find that very insulting, goes against the science. Are you a doctor or a medical doctor?
I've worked over 30 years on health policy.
You're not a medical doctor. Do you have a science degree? And yet you travel the country calling people flat earthers who have had COVID, looked at studies of millions of people, and made their own personal decision that their immunity they naturally acquired is sufficient. But you presume somehow to tell over 100 million Americans who have survived COVID that we have no right to determine our own medical care. You alone are on high, and you've made these decisions, a lawyer with no scientific background, no medical degree. This is an arrogance coupled with an authoritarianism that is unseemly and un-American. You, sir, are the one ignoring the science. The vast preponderance of scientific studies, dozens and dozens, show robust, long-lasting immunity after COVID infection. Even the CDC does not recommend measles vaccine if you have measles immunity. The same was true for smallpox. But you ignore history and science to shame the flat earthers, as you call them. You should be ashamed of yourself and apologize to the American people for being dishonest about naturally acquired immunity. You want more people to choose vaccination? So do I. You want to lessen vaccine hesitancy? So do I. You want to have that happen? Quit lying to people about naturally acquired immunity. Quit lording it over people, acting as if these people are deplorable and unwashed. Try persuasion instead of government cudgels. Try humility instead of arrogance. Try freedom instead of coercion. But most of all, try understanding that there's no more basic medical right than deciding what we inject into our bodies. Today, after hearing that millions of people in a study show without a doubt that there's a great deal of immunity from getting it naturally, do you want to apologize to the 100 million Americans who suffered through COVID, survived, have immunity, and yet you want to hold them down and vaccinate them? Do you want to apologize for calling those people flat earthers?
Senator, I appreciate your question and appreciate that everyone has their opinion. We follow the facts and the science at HHS. We use the expertise of the medical professionals, the scientists at HHS to make decisions. It's a team effort, and we rely on what is on the ground showing us results.
Except for the dozens and dozens of studies. In fact, most, if not all of the studies show robust immunity from getting the disease naturally. The CDC says if you've had measles and have immunity, you don't have to be vaccinated. The same was true of smallpox. You're selectively doing this because you want us to submit to your will. You have no scientific background, no scientific degrees, and yet you aren't really concerned about 100 million Americans who had the disease. You just want to tell us, do as you're told. That's what you're telling us. You want to mandate this on all of us. You're going to tell us if I have 100 employees, you're going to put me out of business with a $700,000 fine if I don't obey what you think is a science. Don't you understand that it's presumptuous for you to be in charge of all the science? Have you ever heard of a second opinion? I can't go to my doctor and ask my doctor's opinion. I mean, this is incredibly arrogant, combined with this authoritarian nature that you think, well, we'll just tell all of America to do what I say, and they better, or we'll fine them, or put them in jail, or not let them go to school, or not let them travel. The science is against you on this. The science is clear. Naturally acquired immunity is as good as a vaccine. The Israel study actually showing it better. This isn't an argument against the vaccine, but it's an argument for letting people make a decision who already have immunity. You're not willing to consider natural immunity?
Senator, our team has reviewed every study that's out there on COVID, whether it's from Israel, from the U.S., or wherever else. They have used the facts that have been provided through the rigorous research that's been done to reach a conclusion. 660,000 Americans and more have died because of COVID. We're trying to do everything we can to save as many as possible. We're using the facts, we're following the science, and following the law.
Nobody's arguing the severity of this, but you are completely ignoring the science on natural immunity. So's Fauci, so's the whole group. You're just ignoring it because you want submission. You want everybody just to submit to your will, do as you're told, despite the evidence, the large body of scientific evidence that says naturally acquired immunity does work, is an important part of how we're all going to recover from this. So's the vaccine. But when you add them together, we're at a much different place than if you ignore them. 100 million Americans, by conservative CDC estimates, have had the disease. 200 million or more now have been vaccinated. It's a good thing. Combined together, it's how the disease is. Nobody wants to get the disease. We're not advising anybody to get the disease. But if you were unlucky enough to get it, think of the nurses and doctors and orderlies who all bravely took care of COVID patients. There was no vaccine for a year and a half. They took care of people, risked their lives. They got it, survived, and now people like you are arrogant enough to say, you can no longer work in the hospital because you've already had the disease. We're going to force you to take a vaccine that the science does not prove is better than naturally acquired. That's an arrogance that should be chastened.
Thank you.